Alexander's genius is legendary, but the empire he built depended on something darker. Terror, on a scale that stunned the ancient world. In just a decade, he ordered crucifixions by the thousands, wiped entire cities from the map, and sent tens of thousands into slavery, all to break the will of his enemies. Why did he believe victory required such ruthless brutality? And what did it cost those who defied him? To understand the real price of Alexander's greatest conquests, we must begin at the walls of a city that thought it could resist. Alexander's engineers and soldiers faced the impossible, a city floating half a mile offshore, surrounded by deep water and walls that rose 150 feet above the waves. The order was simple: build a road across the sea. The reality was 7 months of backbreaking labor and death. Every day, thousands hauled stone and timber, tearing down the ruins of old Tyre to create a causeway 200 feet wide enough for siege towers to roll side by side. By the end, more than 5 million cubic feet of rock and rubble vanished into the channel, inching the army closer to the city walls. Tyrian defenders turned the sea into a killing field. Warships prowled the flanks, loosing arrows and hurling burning sand onto the workers. Boiling oil cascaded from the battlements, clinging to skin and armor. The deadliest attacks came at night. Tyrian fireships, packed with pitch and dry brush, drifted silently toward the half-finished causeway. When the flames caught, siege towers and palisades erupted, sending men leaping into the black water. In a single month, nearly 300 drowned, 200 more died screaming under oil and sand, and another 180 burned alive when fireships broke through the barricades. Every setback was met with more stone, more bodies, more relentless will. Alexander ordered the construction of even taller siege towers, clad in rawhide to resist fire, and brought in a supporting fleet from Sidon and Cyprus to shield the workers. The causeway kept growing, rebuilt after every attack, no matter the cost. The price was measured in Macedonian lives, spent not for victory alone, but to show the world that defiance would be drowned in blood and stone. Battering rams finally punched through Tyre's southern wall. Macedonian soldiers surged into the city, their pent-up fury unleashed after months of blood and humiliation. The streets became a maze of chaos and slaughter. Tyrian defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, fought desperately from house to house. By nightfall, the city was slick with blood. Arian records that 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the fighting, men cut down in their homes, at the temples, or trying to flee toward the sea. The massacre did not end with the last sword thrust. Alexander, enraged by the loss of his men and the murder of his envoys, ordered a punishment meant to echo across the Mediterranean. 2,000 surviving military-age men were rounded up and crucified along the shoreline. Their bodies lined the beach, nailed to wooden beams, a grisly warning visible for miles to any ship approaching the ruined harbor. The horror did not spare the living. 30,000 women and children, Tyrians and foreign refugees alike, were seized and sold into slavery. Families were torn apart in the scramble for captives, and the city's population vanished almost overnight. The logistics of enslavement were staggering. Slave dealers and soldiers herded prisoners in chains, sorting them for transport to markets in Egypt, Greece, and beyond. Tyre, once the jewel of Phoenicia, ceased to exist as an independent city. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would not bring terms or mercy. It would bring annihilation, broadcast in the language of crucifixion and chains. Alexander's lesson at Tyre would become a blueprint for terror, adapted again and again as his armies marched east. Military historians still argue over what happened at Tyre, whether it was ruthless genius or a crime against humanity in all but name. Frank L. Holt, one of the leading scholars on Alexander's campaigns, calls Tyre the template of fear. For Holt, the logic was simple. By making an example so brutal, Alexander could terrify other cities into surrendering without a fight. The causeway, the slaughter, the crucifixions, these were not just acts of rage, but deliberate signals. Tyre's fate became a story whispered in every port from Egypt to Anatolia. Cities that might have resisted now saw what defiance would cost. But not everyone accepts the idea that necessity justifies everything. Michael Walzer, a leading voice in just war theory, points out that even in the chaos of ancient warfare, there were lines. Walzer argues that the crucifixion of 2,000 men along the beach was not just punishment, it was disproportionate, a spectacle meant to terrorize, not simply to subdue. By modern standards, he says, this would be called a war crime. The deliberate targeting of non-combatants and the use of mass execution as a weapon of psychological warfare. The enslavement of 30,000 women and children, in Walzer's view, can't be explained away by the logic of deterrence. It's a reminder that the machinery of conquest often runs on the suffering of the powerless. Between these two poles, strategy and atrocity, runs the question that still haunts Alexander's legacy. Was the destruction of Tyre a cold calculation to save lives in future campaigns? Or was it the unleashing of a conqueror's wrath? The answer depends on where one draws the line between military necessity and moral restraint. At Tyre, that line was buried under stone, blood, and the silence of the enslaved. Thebes stood behind 7 gates, its walls thick with legend and pride. To the Greeks, this was the city of Heracles, birthplace of mythic heroes, a place believed too sacred for destruction. But in 335 BCE, the city council faced a choice that would decide its fate. Alexander, just 20 years old and commanding 30,000 Macedonian troops, offered terms. Surrender. Now, accept a garrison, and the city would be spared. Thebes, with only 7,000 defenders, weighed the offer. Some elders urged caution, warning that defiance against such force would bring ruin. Others, trusting in their walls and their history, demanded resistance. Rumors of Persian gold and Athenian support fueled their confidence. Thebes rejected the ultimatum, convinced that Alexander would not dare destroy a city so central to Greek identity. The Macedonian camp waited, siege engines at the ready. For days, the air was thick with tension. Then, in the confusion of an early morning, a single gate was left unguarded. Whether by treachery or mistake, the opening was all Alexander needed. His infantry surged through, led by officers who had grown up hearing stories of Theban glory. The defenders rushed to seal the breach, but the numbers were overwhelming. Macedonian phalanxes pressed forward, shields locked, spears leveled. Thebes' sacred status offered no protection against the cold logic of conquest. The battle spilled into the streets, the defenders fighting desperately to save their city. With every step, Alexander's army made it clear: mercy would not follow defiance. What began as a standoff ended in chaos. The fate of Thebes sealed before most of its citizens understood the danger at their gates. Macedonian search squads fanned out through Thebes, splitting into tight phalanxes that moved from block to block. The order was clear: kill every military-age male, spare only those who took shelter in temples or the house of the poet Pindar. For 3 days, the city became a hunting ground. Soldiers kicked down doors, dragged men from hiding places, and cut them down in streets and courtyards. The fighting was not random chaos. It was systematic, mapped and commanded by officers who marked each quarter for destruction. Archaeological digs revealed deep burn layers beneath the modern city, the charred remains of homes and theaters that once stood at the heart of Greek culture. The death toll climbed to 6,000. Bodies piled in alleys and squares, left where they fell until the killing was done. Macedonian commanders kept lists, ensuring no quarter was given except where Alexander's exceptions applied. The house of Pindar stood untouched, a lone survivor amid the wreckage, while the city's temples became overcrowded sanctuaries. Everywhere else, the work was methodical and relentless. Those not killed faced another fate. 29,000 men, women, and children were herded together and sold into slavery, an entire population erased in less than a week. Slave traders moved in as soon as the fighting ended, sorting the captives for transport to markets from Athens to Asia. For 20 years, Thebes remained a wasteland, its ruins a warning to all of Greece. Resistance would not just be punished, it would be erased. News of Thebes' destruction traveled faster than any army. Within days, envoys from Athens, Corinth, and Sparta arrived at Alexander's camp, not to protest, but to pledge obedience. Historian Mary Whitby describes the effect as immediate and absolute. The League of Corinth, once a fragile alliance, now bent to Macedonian will without a hint of resistance. No city dared challenge the conqueror who had erased Thebes from the map. Thebes' fate became a cautionary tale, a living threat that hung over every council chamber in Greece. Whitby argues that, for Alexander, terror worked where years of diplomacy had failed. Thebes was not just defeated, it was erased to keep the empire's rear secure while he marched east. But the moral cost of this strategy still troubles scholars. Ethicist Jonathan Perry points out that the annihilation of Thebes crossed a line, turning military victory into collective punishment. 30,000 people, men, women, and children, were condemned to slavery for the crime of rebellion. Perry argues that, even by the standards of ancient warfare, Alexander's response was out of proportion. The destruction sent a message, but at the price of wiping out a city revered by Greeks for over 1,000 years. In his view, the razing of Thebes stands as an early example of deterrence by atrocity, where the suffering of innocents was used as a weapon. The debate between deterrence and overkill still echoes in the study of Alexander's conquests. Thebes was pacified, Greece submitted, and the road to Asia lay open. Yet the ruins left behind forced the world to confront the true cost of order, built on fear. The Zagros Mountains closed in like a trap. At the Persian Gate, Ariobarzanes' forces blocked the only road to Persepolis, dug in above a narrow pass where sheer cliffs left no room for maneuver. Alexander's first assault was a disaster. Macedonian phalanxes packed into the defile were hammered by rocks, arrows, and spears raining down from the heights. In a single morning, hundreds of men fell, speared in the crush, trampled by their own ranks, or knocked from the icy ledges into the ravine below. The pass became a bottleneck of bodies and broken shields. Retreat offered no relief. Winter storms rolled over the mountains, turning the ground to slick mud and freezing the wounded where they lay. Alexander sent scouts searching for a solution. Captured locals, herdsmen who knew every hidden trail, revealed a secret. A goat path, twisting over the high ridges, bypassing the Persian position. The price was steep. To take the path meant 3 days and nights of forced marching through snowdrifts and blizzards, with no chance to resupply or rest. Alexander split his army. Craterus held the main force in the valley, staging diversionary attacks to pin the Persians in place. Meanwhile, Alexander handpicked 10,000 of his toughest veterans, hypaspists and elite foot companions, and led them into the teeth of the storm. The climb was brutal. Men lost their footing and vanished over icy cliffs. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and sometimes entire limbs. Rations ran out. The dead were left behind, frozen in the snow or buried by drifts. By the time Alexander's column reached the far side of the ridge, hundreds had perished from cold, exhaustion, or falls. The survivors were gaunt and battered, but they had achieved the impossible. They now stood behind the Persian defenses, poised to spring the trap that would decide the fate of the empire. At dawn, Alexander gave a single order. No Persian soldier was to be spared. As the sun rose over the narrow pass, Macedonian phalanxes surged from both ends, Craterus pressing from the front, Alexander's veterans slamming into the Persian rear. Trapped between sheer cliffs and enemy spears, the defenders had nowhere to run. Panic tore through the Persian lines as formations buckled, men crushed together in the chaos. The slaughter was relentless. Macedonian swordsmen cut down archers and spearmen alike, moving methodically through the packed ranks. Arrows snapped against shields, but the encirclement closed tighter with every minute. Some Persians tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and begging for mercy. Alexander's command was absolute. None were to be taken alive. The killing did not pause. Ariobarzanes, the Persian satrap, broke free with a handful of horsemen, riding hard for Persepolis. Macedonian cavalry hunted them down, cutting them from their saddles 20 kilometers from the battlefield. By nightfall, the pass was silent, except for the wind and the cries of the dying. 20,000 Persians lay dead among the rocks. The ground ran red, the snow stained with blood. The Macedonian dead were gathered in silence. Their sacrifice weighed against the price of victory. Alexander had proved that resistance would be answered with total destruction, and that surrender was the only hope of survival. Victor Davis Hanson, a leading historian of ancient warfare, calls the Persian Gate campaign a masterclass in adaptive genius. He points to Alexander's decision to split his forces and gamble on a deadly winter flanking march as proof of a commander willing to spend lives for victory. In Hanson's view, the sacrifice of Macedonian soldiers, hundreds freezing to death or falling from cliffs, was the price of breaking the Persian line and opening the road to Persepolis. For him, this was not reckless brutality, but the cold calculus of a strategist who understood that hesitation would mean failure, and that the fate of an empire sometimes rested on the willingness to endure horror. But ethicist Sarah Khan sees the cost in human terms. She argues that Alexander's refusal to allow surrender at the Persian Gate crossed a moral line, turning a hard-won tactical victory into an act of vengeance. Khan points to the command that no Persian be spared, and the deliberate sacrifice of Macedonian lives in the freezing mountains, as evidence of a conqueror who valued terror above the men who followed him. For her, the massacre was not a necessity, but a choice, a demonstration that the pursuit of glory could justify any cruelty, even against one's own. The debate remains unresolved. Was the annihilation at the Persian Gate a feat of military necessity, or did it reveal the darker cost of an empire built on fear? The answer depends on whether the measure of greatness is found in victory alone, or in the price paid to achieve it. Alexander's legacy still shapes how power is projected and justified, from shock and awe campaigns to scorched earth tactics. The tools of terror he wielded remain part of modern warfare's playbook, studied, debated, and sometimes repeated. History proves that ruthlessness can build empires, but it rarely secures peace. How we remember these choices shapes the leaders we tolerate today. What price are we willing to accept for victory?